The rain battered the glass walls of the penthouse like 1,000 impatient fingers demanding entry, and in the shadows of the dimly lit office the CEO, Adrian Vale, the man the media worshipped as the golden playboy king of the business world, knelt on the thick woven carpet with his wrists trembling against the polished mahogany desk, his voice cracking as he whispered, "Please, don't make me undress." Not with the arrogance he was famous for but with the desperation of a cornered animal. Because the man towering above him was not someone the tabloids could ever prepare him for, he was a cold, black-clad single father named Cale Draven, a man whose silence was more terrifying than anyone's shouts, whose presence carried the weight of war and winters and things no white-collar executive could imagine surviving, and in that silence Cale's dark eyes glinted not with cruelty but with an inevitability that struck deeper, like a sentence already delivered before the crime was confessed. The office smelled faintly of cedar and ink, but underneath it lingered fear, Adrian's fear, metallic and sharp like blood in the air, and Cale slowly reached into his coat, not for a weapon, though Adrian expected one, but for a folded photograph, creased from years of handling, and he tossed it onto the desk. The picture slid across the glossy surface until it stopped at Adrian's knees, and when Adrian looked down his pupils constricted, because the smiling little girl in the photograph had the same emerald eyes as his, a shade inherited not from him but from the woman he'd betrayed, and the betrayal had not been romantic, not directly, it had been financial, a hostile maneuver disguised as a business acquisition that had crushed Cale's late sister's small startup like a boot on a butterfly, leaving her desperate, drowning in debt, and eventually swallowed by an illness Adrian's corporate lawyers refused to acknowledge as related, and Adrian's voice quavered, I didn't know. But Cale's reply was cold as an executioner's blade, "You knew enough to profit," and that was when the doors clicked shut with a subtle finality that made Adrian's skin crawl. The city lights flickered far below them, neon bleeding into the storm as if the night itself understood that something irreversible was unfolding in this skyscraper throne room, and Adrian's thoughts raced, about the shareholders who adored him, the scandals he always escaped untouched, the power he wielded. Yet none of those things meant anything to the man before him, because Cale was not here for headlines or money, he was here for consequences, and consequences cared nothing for brand reputation. Adrian swallowed hard as Cale stepped closer, his boots soundless against the carpet, and for a moment Adrian flashed back to childhood, to his father telling him that men with nothing left to lose were the most dangerous of all, and now that lesson breathed in front of him. Cale's voice was low when he said, "Take off the jacket," and Adrian shook his head wildly, thinking it a humiliation ritual, but Cale wasn't interested in degradation, he wanted evidence, scars, truth, whichever came first, and as Adrian's fingers fumbled with the buttons the thunder roared like applause outside the glass, drowning the sound of his stuttered breathing, and finally the jacket fell away revealing not smooth, unblemished privilege but the bruises he had been hiding from investors and paparazzi alike, purple and yellow maps of violence across his ribs, signs of a war waged in silence within the boardroom against rival executives who played dirtier than the public would ever know. Cale's brows twitched, not with sympathy but with recognition, because he'd seen those colors on soldiers under command, and the absurdity of it, that a CEO could be wounded like a soldier, pulled at something old and rusted in Cale's chest. Adrian gasped as if confession were leaking out through his pores, whispering about leverage deals and blackmail schemes and a board member who wanted him replaced so badly he sent his private security after him, and Cale listened, not because he cared about Adrian's empire but because every story has threads and sometimes threads tie back to the dead. Adrian didn't know yet that Cale's sister's downfall hadn't been an isolated tragedy, it had been orchestrated, engineered by the same power players circling Adrian now, a vulture circle that consumed both innocents and kings. Suddenly the lights flickered and the office screens lit up with encrypted streams. Cale had hacked into the building security system, showing the elevators frozen on the ground floors and the emergency stairs locked from outside command, and Adrian's eyes widened as realization hit. It wasn't Cale he needed protection from, it was the board, and Cale, in his cold, unfeeling way, was the only one forcing the truth into daylight. "Stand," Cale ordered, and Adrian obeyed because there was no power in the world greater than someone who refused to fear you, and as he stood there shaking, shirt hanging open, the rain beyond them intensified into sheets of silver, like the world itself had turned into a curtain between them and everyone else. sealing the scene into its own universe. Cale stepped toward the wall safe behind the abstract painting, entering a code that wasn't supposed to be known by anyone but Adrian. And the safe opened with a soft mechanical sigh revealing documents that smelled of ink and rot, contracts signed by Adrian but altered afterward in ways he had never authorized, agreements linking Cale's sister's falling company to offshore shell accounts, implicating her in fraud she had never committed, and Adrian's face drained of color, because even he hadn't been aware how deep the conspiracy went. "I thought it was just business," he whispered, trembling as if the truth itself demanded penance, and Cale leaned close enough for Adrian to feel his breath against his ear as he answered, "That's what every man says before he learns what his decisions cost," and at that moment Adrian understood why Cale said he had no choice. He wasn't here to strip him of dignity, he was here to strip him of ignorance. Outside, sirens wailed faintly through the storm, a reminder that time was moving forward, that the world was still watching, even if it could not see them. Adrian exhaled, shaky, as if trying to hold on to the last piece of denial he possessed, and Cale said, "You will undress the lies, layer by layer, until there is nothing left to hide," and for the first time in his gilded life, the CEO felt an emotion stronger than fear, accountability, heavy and suffocating, but somewhere beneath it, like the faintest ember in a drowned hearth, burned something else, the possibility that this man who had come as an executioner might yet become an unlikely savior. Because in a twisted world of power and profit, only contradictions survive, and Adrian Vale had just discovered his. Morning broke like a wounded animal over the city, dragging streaks of pale gold and steel across the skyline as the storm finally surrendered, but inside Cale's warehouse safehouse, a cavernous space converted from an abandoned textile factory into a minimalist fortress, silence reigned with the authority of a judge, and Adrian Vale sat on a metal chair with chains loosely encircling his wrists, not because Cale needed to restrain him but because Adrian didn't yet know he was free to stand. Free to walk, free to question. Captivity had been a psychological thing all along, and the crushing weight of truth he'd learned the night before lingered in his bones like a fever.